You can see I'm Sazini Mojapelo, and you've already seen. I am responsible for corporate citizenship within the bank. When I got the opportunity to speak today, my first inkling was not to speak about Absa. I think everyone knows what Absa does. You know that we're in the financial services, but most importantly, my team said to me, we need to speak about how we drive innovative financing for development impact. What does that mean? So when we curated the thinking and put together the ideas with Trialogue, what was important for us was to be very clear around how and what innovative financing is. And most importantly, how that will unlock and drive development. So whilst I'm aware that this conference has got a multi-sectoral approach, and I think it's quite opportune that we're able to talk about this at this time, there is need for us to move away from looking at CSI as CSI and start, even go beyond just strategic CSI. There is a place for it, don't get me wrong. But if we're going to drive sustainability and create the right level of meaningful impact, I think it's critical that we start looking at how we deploy capital and our resources in a manner that allows civil society organizations, government and private sector to drive sustainable outcomes in the long term. So what I will share with you today, I will speak around what innovative financing is, types of it, why it's important, and I'll anchor that discussion around the Sustainable Development Goals. So I was quite happy to see you speak about that. And I'll try and unpack it a bit more so we get to see how you can categorize it and what kind of investments can be unlocked to drive development outcomes. And lastly, because I'm from Absa, I'll use Absa as a case study, not speak about Absa, but use Absa as a case study for you to see how we have, what we've done in renewable energy, how we've thought about our capital and investments quite differently. So, this is supposed to go to next. Okay. I point it this way, it will click. Okay. So what is innovative financing? The definition is up there. But I'll just put it in pedestrian terms, very clearly. Simple terms. It's a way for us to look at how we can use different forms of financing to merge, develop, and drive different types of outcomes. In this particular case, we're going to speak to development outcomes that are sustainable and long-term and that create systemic impact. So if you read that, it says it has to be positive outcomes. They have to be measurable in terms of social and environmental impact. And they have, most importantly, be able to demonstrate some form of financial return. As a bank, we have engaged and are on the journey of creating shared value and how we do that as a business. So these kind of terms become very important in how, as financial services, we need to be thinking and looking at things differently. So if you look at that definition, what we have then done is to look at what types of innovative financing are we talking about. Just to unpack it a bit more, I've chosen 4. The rest of the panel that will speak and people who come after me will also touch on different elements around it. But for my particular discussion, I've identified 4 areas. The first is development impact bonds. I'm sure most of you have some experience or have some knowledge around it. But it literally is a vehicle that enables investors to give their capital or funding upfront to achieve development outcomes. And what happens is government is able to then pay back those funds in bond format. I've given an example there. For example, in Swaziland, they've looked at how to come up with vaccines around HIV/AIDS. So you've got large, high net worth individuals, private investors that have given funding in billions to support that cause. The next one is green bonds. And I'm weary about green bonds because they've become very populist in their conversation, yet they serve a very good purpose. Green bonds are simply bonds that they follow the conventional method of execution, but what is different about them is that the outcomes and proceeds of those bonds has to have positive environmental impact. And they're very important. And I'm proud to say in Africa, South Africa is the country that has issued the most green bonds. And we are leading in that direction. We've done it through the GSC, and we've also done it at city level with the city of Cape Town. Other countries like Morocco have started looking into it, and Kenya. Crowdfunding is one which most of you would recognize. And the example I used there was Kiva, that do crowdfunding platform. And they support people who give small amounts of money towards investment. It can be in soft loans, or it can be actually grant format. And the last one is blended financing. This is simply the strategic use of development finance. And it just leads to sustainable development outcomes. So if you're looking at it from the perspective that if we have these 4 types that I've opted to describe today, how do we do it? What does it mean for us as a business? What does it mean for you if you're in the civil society organization, or you're in government, or you're in a global development organization? How do you use these 4 instruments? The first, I'll take the leaf from the Sustainable Development Goals. So I will use the illustration of the SDGs to demonstrate how innovative financing can lead to clear sustainable outcomes and help us achieve some of these objectives. Globally, we have seen, and our research has extensively shown, that with by using innovative financing, blending different types of capital and resources, we'll be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. It is not traditional sources of income that will drive that. It's not only traditional sources of income, but we need to start thinking innovatively about how to shift and change the space. And we have certainly started doing that in South Africa. There's the SDG Hub that has been established. It's housed in the University of Pretoria. And it allows South African people who are participating or trying to reach milestones around the SDGs to populate that and put forward their cause. There is a business commission that was set up soon after the SDGs were launched in 2016. And what they set up, the business commission is over 100 global CEOs that pulled together thinking and ideas of how we can turn and look at the SDGs in a manner that drives business agenda versus it just being a philanthropic CSI approach. It was a strategic shift away from the Millennium Development Goals that I'm sure we're all aware of, the MDGs, that were quite government-driven and civil society focused, to looking at if they're sustainable development goals. The top 6 goals, I like to say, are quite civil society driven, and they speak to the broader humanitarian agenda. The next 6 are quite business focused if you look at them. They start speaking to outcomes like industry and innovation, and how we as private sector need to be thinking and driving innovation within that space. So if you unpack those 17 goals, you can literally, within these 4, as private sector, you can unlock to the value of $12 trillion US. But what it requires of us is to all think differently. Stop CSI being just CSI. Start looking at it as an investment in communities, and how, therefore, you can crowd in other funders. Which funders? Like Absa, like Vodacom. But the thinking has to be different and strategic. It cannot just be about grant making and donations. So if you look at these 4, they identified 60 biggest SDG market opportunities globally. So if we are to achieve these objectives, we can literally classify them into 4. Food and agriculture, cities, the growth of cities. Approximately 60% of the world's population will be living in cities by 2030. But they're overcrowded right now. There's not enough sufficient infrastructure for it. So we need to be looking at how to invest within that. Blended financing obviously plays a big role if you look at social housing as an example. The health and well-being. Our health services will be in strain. And currently, we don't actually have good health, and there's no access to healthcare. How do we start thinking about that differently? Those civil society organizations that are operating in the health space, private sector companies that are in the health space, your Discovery, that are in the insurance space, the medical, the private hospitals, but also look at what the government is providing and the policies around that, and look at how do we start financing them differently? How do we provide global health care in a manner that is more sustainable? And the biggest breakthrough within this space has been technology. The ability, I know some of us wear Fitbit, but imagine if people in the rural areas had it. They would diagnose their state, their diabetes, their heart issues before they even have to go to hospital. So that is the thinking around that. How do we look at that as a business opportunity? At the same time, very important for the NGOs in that space to look at how to provide access. It's time to shift the thinking. The last is energy and minerals. That's renewable energy. And I'm sure some of us are very aware of that. So I want to pose a challenge back into the room. When we were pulling this together, I said, you know what, one of the things that we have done, I think, with my team and with other financial services partners has been around how we look at the challenges facing Africa and look at them as opportunities. If we look at the SDGs and the opportunity to grow investments within that space, the opportunity to drive innovative financing, it is not in Europe or the other continents, it actually is in the developing countries. So if we take those SDGs and say, yes, there are challenges, and we see them, but let's look at them from a business perspective, which is what most companies have actually done. And they are based out of the Americas, out of Europe. If you look at that picture there, those pipes, that equipment, the solar beams, who's producing that? Why is it not manufactured here? That's a business opportunity. Who's supplying it? How is it getting into the ground? So if we start looking at what is good sanitation, who's producing that? Who's doing that? And I think as civil society, you have access. Private sector is looking for business opportunities and looking at business models that are sustainable, but yet with good social and positive outcomes. Let's start looking at it differently. They say by 2025, internet penetration is expected to reach 50% of the continent. Smartphone users rising to 350 million. What are the opportunities that are within that for you sitting in this room today, not thinking of writing another proposal for funding, not me reviewing a proposal, but thinking of that as an opportunity that unlocks sustainable, positive outcomes? So, what is Absa's contribution and investment? I'll speak briefly. I can see it's flashing, Thabang. So we have looked at what we have done across the bank. Said, in terms of innovative financing, what have we financed? What do we do? And is it the lens that we provide and look at quite clearly and say, we are going to do this, and what does it mean for us? We've given some examples. Quality education, where we've provided scholarships to over 10,000 scholarships to date in over 3 years, in over 100 universities across the country, across the continent. As Absa, we are operating as Barclays in 9 other countries, Absa in South Africa, soon to be Absa across the continent. So those statistics, and over 750 million rands we've spent in education. So if we look at the SDG hub, that's collating the impact that's been received and done to date around achieving these by South Africa as a country and the different countries, these are the kind of stats that as private sector, civil society organizations and governments we need to be pulling together. If you look at affordable and clean energy, we have financed 12 renewable energy projects in South Africa, 7 that are in wind, 4 solar, and 1 looking at biomass, and 33 projects across. So if you look at this synopsis that I've presented here, you can actively see how a company our size is able to start contributing towards the SDGs. And I'll be very quick to say, this is not done in isolation. It is done in partnership. So if you look there, one of the ones we've listed is SDG 17, partnerships, and I've listed Trilogue as well. Because it's important to have these kind of platforms where we speak around what is the next frontier, what lies in the horizon, and the way we need to shift our thinking to drive sustainable positive income outputs. I do not think that in this day and age we can drive purely a CSI outcome. We do need to be thinking and innovating differently. I end with a statement from a number of a journal that we got. I read, "The need for more innovative finance mobilized by various institutions has never been greater. If executed well, with the right regulations, it could be the single most important lever in delivering the global goals, thus driving economic growth across the continents." I thank you.